Good afternoon, boys. So today we're starting our lesson on evolution. You can see I've changed the format of our notes just slightly to kind of a mind map version rather than our grid version for today. I feel that it'll work better. Hopefully at this stage you have looked at the video that I put the link up in Teams of the race between Wallace and Darwin to kind of publish and announce their theory of natural selection. I suppose when we're studying this chapter, we're almost imagining a world that's very different from ours, where communication was quite different. We communicate quite easily with the internet now, so we can see all different types of species quite easily and the differences between them. But we have to take our time back to, I suppose, Darwin's time and Wallace's time in the early 1800s, where they didn't have that type of communication, and they thought maybe in the UK there was only one type of finch bird, there was only one type of moth, so they hadn't seen changes in species up until that time, until they started to travel. If we're looking today at our learning intentions, our first learning intention will be defining evolution. So we'll be looking at what evolution actually is. Then we'll be looking at the theory of natural selection that was outlined by Darwin and Wallace. And then we will be looking at a piece of evidence that actually shows us that evolution has occurred. And there's three options. You can either use a fossil, comparative anatomy, or studies of embryos, and we're going to pick the fossil one. Okay, if we go back, I suppose, to the central part here, and even before I mention what evolution is, we might mention that we've said this a lot in our fifth year biology classes already. So we've studied bacteria, and we've looked at the idea in bacteria, and I suppose fearfully the idea that bacteria has evolved, and now some antibiotics won't kill bacteria anymore, and our example of that would be MRSA bacteria. So it has evolved so that the antibiotics can't damage its cell machinery. I suppose when we might have mentioned from the junior cycle might have been the peppered moth. So the idea that maybe in 1830 that the peppered moth, the idea that moths at the time were light coloured, the trees, the barks of the trees were light coloured, the lichens or lichens that grew on the trees were light coloured. And we know that lichens or lichens don't like pollution. So when the Industrial Revolution occurred, say in 1850, the barks of the trees started to darken and the lichens or lichens died off because they couldn't survive in the pollution. And before there had been a dark coloured moth, a parasitic moth, but it didn't really survive before this because the birds used to see it on the trees with the light coloured moths. So a lot of them had died off. But when the Industrial Revolution occurred, this parasitic moth thrived because he could survive in the darkness, whereas the light coloured moth could easily be picked off. So they had to really go into almost hibernation until 1890, until the revolution was over and pollution improved again. And now to this day we have light coloured moths instead, and the parasitic one died off. So I suppose if we're giving these as examples of evolution, the MRSA and the peppered moth, if we went back to the definition of evolution, our key words really are the idea that it's the way organisms change genetically. So there's a change in their DNA, but it's over a long period of time. You could be talking about thousands, millions of years. We'll see that with the horse evolution in a while. And that they had to change in response to environmental conditions. And sometimes it even ends up with a new form of an organism being formed. So I suppose keywords, it's a change genetically over a long period of time, and the change is due to environmental conditions changing. So they're trying to survive. Then if we move down to our second learning intention for today was to discuss the Darwin and Wallace theory of natural selection. And you really should have a good idea of this now from watching the video earlier on that I put up in Teams. So if we look at just a quick summary of that, I had just put down here between Darwin and Wallace. So I suppose if we were looking at Darwin's travels, it was like 1832 for 5 years, came from a rich family, had lots of backing, royalty had sponsored his boat, the HMS Beagle. He went to the Galapagos Islands, spent a lot of time in those islands for 5 years, looking, for example, at the finches, and started to realise as he went from one island to the next that the finches had different shaped beaks. And the shape of their beak all depended on what they had eaten. So maybe if they were eating in between rocks, they might have had a very long, narrow beak. If they were eating flies off the back of a whale, it might be more blunt, softer beak. He also noticed in tortoises, as he went from one Galapagos island to the next, that they had different shaped shells. So some of them had a plain dome-shaped shell, and they could bend their head down and eat vegetation low down. But in another island they went to, they had to eat up high in the trees. And he noticed that in the dome there was like a curve, so they could stick their head up really high to eat up high. He came home and started to publish some of his findings. His book was called The Origin of the Species, a very famous book, and it contained his ideas of natural selection. I suppose he was pushed on to print all this because Wallace, another naturalist who is really a biologist that studies the impact of species on each other and their environment, was hot on his tail discovering evolution as well, and that all species actually weren't the very same and that they had inherited characteristics that they were passing down to each other. Wallace came from a poor background, and he did a lot of his research in Southeast Asia, in Borneo in particular, and he did a lot of studying butterflies, but we could see a lot of his research was lost on the way home with a fire on his boat, but still had the same ideas as Darwin. So both of them are now credited with coming up with the idea of theory of natural selection. It was published in 1858, so that's an important date for you to remember. And I suppose there's 3 observations of this theory and there's 2 conclusions, and I grouped one of the observations with one of the conclusions. So some of these are very obvious to us in common sense. So when they went on their journeys, they noticed that there was a high reproductive rate and there was a lot of overbreeding. So for example, you could have one tree producing 1,000 seeds, and how are all of those going to survive? Or you could have one fish laying 1,000 eggs. How are all of those offspring going to survive? So they concluded if there was so much overbreeding, then their conclusion was that there must be a struggle for existence, that the environment couldn't support all of these. And then they came up with the idea, which we know all the time now in our discussions in biology, that there must be competition for scarce resources. So it might be animals competing for mate, space, food, or it might be trees competing for water, minerals, light, space to grow. So they combined together. So overbreeding was occurring, they observed, and then they concluded, well, this must cause a struggle for existence and hence there must be competition. So I really have highlighted keywords here. So in the observation, just the idea that overbreeding was occurring and that there must be a struggle for existence, that's key. And that then there must be competition between them. And the other observations then that they made, I grouped both of these together. The population numbers were remaining constant. So they said, well, there must be something else happening here. And obviously there was competition. And then maybe everybody wasn't surviving. And why wasn't everybody surviving? And they noticed that if there were inherited variations, that they occur in populations, and that these changes were maybe due to sexual reproduction and mutation. So this observation, the idea of overbreeding, but population numbers were remaining constant, variations were being passed on, led them to this conclusion. And the conclusion really is natural selection. And another word or a term for natural selection is survival of the fittest. Sometimes when we see that term, we think it's like the biggest, strongest bird that survives, or the biggest, strongest reptile survives. But it mightn't be. As we saw with the finches, it was because they had better shaped beaks allowed them to survive. Or the tortoises had better shaped domes. They don't have to be physically bigger. They don't have to be mentally better. I just tied in The Origin of the Species, the name of Darwin's book, because that was all on natural selection and survival of the fittest. Organisms, the theory of survival of the fittest is just basically that organisms must adapt, and they have to adapt because there's environmental changes. They have to adapt because there's environmental changes. And if they don't adapt, they're going to die out. So if they don't adapt, they'll die out. And organisms with the new adaptations that they'll reproduce and pass on the variations is key. So if I go back over that again, the idea that natural selection is also called survival of the fittest. Darwin wrote his book on Origin of the Species. Organisms have adapted to survive environmental changes. If they don't, they'll die out. And the new adaptations, when they reproduce, are passed on from one generation to the next. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of the theory of natural selection. If I were you, I'd learn my 3 observations: overbreeding, population numbers remain constant, and inherited variations occur in populations. And then the two conclusions, that there's a struggle for existence, which is competition, and then natural selection, survival of the fittest, occurs. And just lastly, you have to know examples of how evolution actually occurs and why we think evolution has occurred, because I suppose it is a theory. So I'm picking out fossils. So maybe we all remember that Ross in Friends was a paleontologist. So his job was to actually study fossils. So we know that fossils are the dead remains of plants and animals, and they're found in the soil after millions of years. So we might find them on rocks. I suppose in Kilmarquee we would have seen some examples of that, of maybe little worms or even of fish bones in a rock. And the good thing about fossils is that they can be carbon dated, and they can put a time scale then on a particular species. If I was to reference any, the evolution of the horse, and I've put that on your PowerPoint as well on Teams, and I suppose the evolution of the horse, the key things that they really looked at, one of them was height. So 60 million years ago, the height of a horse was 0.4 metres, which is very tiny, whereas 1 million years ago was 1.6 metres. So huge changes in height. And if you look at the PowerPoint even further, you'll see that there's changes maybe in the number of toes. It's gone from a 4-toed animal to just a 1-toed animal. And maybe the changes in height are due to competition. So maybe the tallest only survived, and maybe selective breeding as well. So maybe the taller animals were allowed to mate with the other taller animals, and the smaller animals then didn't survive. So I hope this clears it up a little bit for you, that chapter. So we're looking at 3 learning intentions. Can I define evolution? Can I outline Darwin and Wallace's theory of natural selection? And can I discuss an example of evolution using fossils? I'm going to put a copy of this mind map on your Teams group, and I'm setting up an assignment for you on past questions on this topic as well. Thank you.